most of the visible breakdowns in the budget process are not unique to the current situation. But what is more distinctive of the Trump administration and its relationship to the Congress now is the shift in how enacted budgets get executed. And I think the current administration is really pushing the envelope or blasting through the envelope in those areas about how much the administration can control once Congress has spoken on how much is appropriated for a particular program.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. Today I have two guests who've spent careers inside some of the most impactful, behind-the-scenes offices in the federal government. We'll spend some time trying to shine a light on why this underappreciated work matters. Joining me are Teri Gullo, former Director of Budget Analysis at the Congressional Budget Office, and Karl Maschino, former Chief Financial and Administrative Officer at the Government Accountability Office. Teri, Karl, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we're in a period of intense scrutiny of the federal workforce and federal spending. The Department of Government Efficiency, budget cuts, workforce reductions, all of these things should sound familiar to you. From where you sit, having managed large government operations and overseen budget analysis for decades, what's your honest assessment of how this moment is different or isn't from past cycles of government reform? Karl, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. This is a unique moment, I think, in time in many ways, but government, different administrations that come in usually have a reform agenda of some type. In some senses, we're seeing a similar cycle with an administration coming in and offering up reform. But in other ways, it's uniquely different in the speed under which change is happening, the approach, which, having something like DOGE come in and undertake a series of cuts across the federal government without much analysis. So that is sort of against, what career federal civil servants, would appreciate, I think. There's a lot of decisions being made, a lot of cuts that have taken place that, based off of my experience in managing federal agencies, is a little haphazard and can create ripple effects. It can create inefficiencies. And I think that's problematic for the government going forward. You already see agencies trying to hire back people to fulfill functions that they lost folks in. The Department of Justice has lost several thousand career attorneys just in the last year. In other areas, such as contracting, we've also seen significant cuts in the workforce that I think we'll still see some real effects over the next couple of years.
Teri, different or not?
So there are a lot of similarities in the budget realm from prior years. The ideal system for the budget that was set up in 1974 as part of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act have not worked for many years. So there are some similarities. The system is pretty broken and has been for a long time. What I think is different now is the incredible tension between the legislative branch and the executive branch in terms of who controls what and when. Generally speaking, the Congress provides money, appropriates the money, and the executive branch executes. There's a huge tension now with this current administration really pushing back a lot on Congress and refusing to spend money that they've appropriated, attempting to rescind money that has been provided. So those are the things, that tension in the budget world is really what's different now.
Karl, what is the federal budget process, and are there certain timelines to it? How does that normally work?
I mean, the process, how it normally works is that, the Office of Management and Budget will send out in the spring. So actually now, agencies would be putting together what their proposals would be for the next fiscal year cycle. And they would start with their current services budget and then add anything new that they might want to do. So, for example, you would start with a component at the Justice Department, such as the FBI, and they would put together their planning estimates for the next fiscal year. And then they would submit that to the Department of Justice, Main Justice, and Main Justice would scrub that. And then the Justice Department makes its own priority decisions about what the guidance that they've received from OMB will look like. Maybe they've been asked to show an increase, or maybe they've been asked to show a decrease. So they need to make those numbers work across the entire Justice Department. That is then submitted to the Office of Management and Budget in around September. And the Office of Management Budget goes through that same sort of accountability process, making sure that the programs being put forward will mesh with what the White House has said and our priorities for them. And they'll work with Main Justice to come up with a budget for the following fiscal year. And then the president puts that budget together, and by the first Monday in February, they're supposed to submit the budget for the following fiscal year. The individual agencies in the spring go up and start to discuss with staff what the budget holds for their agencies. They have their hearings. And then over the summer, the Congress is supposed to formulate their spending bills and then have them passed by September 30th of that year to start the next fiscal year. Things are really different now in that, the Constitution clearly says that the Congress controls the purse, and they can formulate a law, essentially an appropriations law, that the president can either sign or veto, and then it's then sent back to Congress or it's passed. But with the dissolution of AID and other decisions being made now, it's not being done in coordination with Congress as it has previously been, and that Congress needs to agree to changes in how money is spent in the appropriation as it's been signed into law. And so that's a major difference now that I think everyone is trying to understand.
Normally, budgeting follows a process, and it would seem as though it's something that is fairly routine. But I don't know that that's happening right now. Teri, is what's happening now following norms, or is it doing something else?
I would say it's doing something else. Most of the visible breakdowns in the budget process, reliance on continuing resolutions, failure to complete appropriations, recurring shutdown, brinksmanship, those things are not unique to the current situation. But what is more distinctive of the Trump administration and its relationship to the Congress now is the shift in how enacted budgets get executed. And that really does go back in some ways to issues related to the 74 Budget and Impoundment Control Act, where there were rules about how impoundments and rescissions would be handled. And I think the current administration is really pushing the envelope or blasting through the envelope in those areas about how much the administration can control once Congress has spoken on how much is appropriated for a particular program.
You've both spent decades in institutions, CBO and GAO, that exist to speak truth to power in a certain sense, whether that's on the Hill or in the executive branch. But what does that actually feel like, Day, to be the person who says, here's what this really costs, or here's what we've actually found? Does budget drive policy? Does policy drive budget? How do those conversations go from the previous positions that you've held?
And I love that question about, does budget drive policy or does policy drive budget? I think the answer is that it depends on in the context, because both are really important. In the budget world, we view budget is policy, right? It's one and the same. It's something that, I spend a lot of time teaching in the class that I currently teach, and something that I've had to work closely with political appointees over many years, and that having an idea is just one step. Understanding how it's funded and how you can get it funded as a strategy through the budget development process is another step. And sometimes people don't understand the two, and they'll ask, well, what is the role of the Office of Management and Budget? And that's where policy and budget come crashing down together in the executive branch, and where the rubber really hits the road. And you need to understand, how policy will actually be funded to have any chance of it passing through the process? So I think that's a great question. And I think with respect to sort of the role of GAO in terms of fact-based, nonpartisan approach to policy analysis, I think that it plays an extraordinarily important role. And as AI and deep fakes are starting to be more the norm in terms of information available out there, places like GAO and CBO and CRS are going to grow in importance. They're very transparent in how they do their analysis and produce their results in a way that these organizations are going to be a place where I think everybody will agree that they can go to for the truth, if you will. And at the very least, they'll understand how the results were arrived at. And I think that's really, really important in today's environment.
And Teri, you've had to speak truth to power when it comes to budgeting as well. What's that like day to day?
It was incredibly exciting and stressful. But what I loved about being at the Congressional Budget Office was that really strong sense of mission the agency has about just telling it like it is and being very straight without any bias, and to the extent that is possible. And I think CBO does a pretty good job of that. CBO was created in 1974 to be a counterweight to OMB. The administration had budget shop, they had information, and that put the Congress at a disadvantage because they didn't have an independent source of information. So CBO was created to provide that information so that the Congress is on more of a level playing field. I think what's important to know about CBO is that CBO is not the scorekeeper. CBO does not make any decisions. They do not enforce any rules. CBO provides information, and it's the budget committees and OMB that are the scorekeepers in terms of making enforcement decisions and implementing programs. That idea that we were providing straightforward, hopefully easy to understand information for those decision makers, and also helping them develop their ideas in a way that comported with the budget laws was a pretty heady experience.
So CBO and GAO both play hugely critical and important roles in helping decision makers understand consequences of policy and decisions. Most analysts would agree we're on an unsustainable path fiscally, and there's certain reasons for that. If CBO and GAO are really the providers of information, what's needed to help get to a balanced budget, to help bring more fiscal responsibility to the federal government?
That is something people are talking a lot about right now, is what's it going to take to fix the broken system. Ultimately, it comes down to the political situation, that things are so polarized in the Congress that incentives to come to the table and compromise are extremely limited, if they exist at all right now. And the way the budget is structured, the way it was set up, was President makes a proposal, the Congress creates a budget resolution that gives them a framework, then they appropriate money, and throughout that process, there are committee hearings, there are conference committees, there's negotiations with the president, and most of that is gone now. So no matter how good your process is, if the political situation is such that those rules are either ignored or nobody can quite grasp them and make use of them, then there's not a lot of hope for fixing the problem. I mean, we can talk about that too, about the need for what I think would be pretty radical reform of the budget process given the current environment.
Karl, what do you think's needed? Radical reform, more information, different leaders on the Hill?
So it's a really difficult problem. There are some solutions out there that try to attack the mandatory spending to get to the budget deficit problem. budget debt problem that we have this year, rather last year, we hit, I believe, $1 trillion in net interest expenses. So it's going to continue to be a significant issue for the federal budget going forward. The process it's difficult at the moment, as Teri rightly pointed out, and it's going to take a significant bipartisan effort to put any strategy together to help address the long-term unsustainable path problem that we have. And as Teri pointed out, at this point in time, it's hard to see that path forward to be able to address those really difficult decisions.
Between the two of you, you've overseen cost estimates for hundreds of pieces of legislation, managed enterprise risk for thousands of employees, and navigated some genuinely chaotic political environments. What's the management lesson that surprised you most? Something you didn't learn in grad school or read in a textbook?
I think with respect to risk management, which is one of my favorite topics, because it's when you talk about enterprise risk management, you're looking at your operations from top to bottom in your organization, and you're identifying those functions that are subject to failure in a sense. And then you look at what's the likelihood of a failure there and what's the potential impact of that. And then you essentially assemble a risk register and you apply mitigation to your top risks. And when GAO did their first enterprise risk management plan, and we worked with OMB to have it become part of OMB's guidance as well as to incorporate it into the Green Book. We sat down, we looked at all of GAO's functions, and we said, well, where are risks and how do we currently manage them? And I think what was really interesting to me is that without formally thinking of a risk mitigation management program for the agency, we had already instituted risk mitigation strategies across the agency in areas that were the most risky, just through the natural, over time, looking at our functions and recognizing where we needed to have more time spent on certain areas, or we need to raise the level of insight into particular functions within the organization just naturally. And so I think when I talk about risk management in my grad school classes now, one of the things that we touch on is the fact that we sort of, as people, we're sort of naturally risk averse, and we try to find ways to mitigate risks in our personal lives, but also in our professional lives. And so that's one takeaway from sort of managing government agencies and as it relates to risk management that I have.
At CBO, one of the things I learned over the years and what became a really important management rule for me was really pushing analysts to explain their work and to explain their answers. I think historically, what's the answer, CBO? Just give us the number. We just want the number. And that's what everybody was looking at. And those numbers are obviously still important. They drive whether or not the budget committees are going to enforce a point of order. But what I think has become more and more important over time is CBO's willingness and ability to explain their reasoning and explain why they came to the conclusions they came to. So it was something that analysts are under a lot of stress, time stress at CBO. You don't have a lot of time to prepare cost estimates, particularly in the current environment where bills don't even go through committee the way they used to, get marked up and they go to the floor at the last minute. So there's a lot of time pressure, but really trying to get analysts to step back and think about what's the story I need to tell that goes along with that number, I think is extremely helpful to the Congress. They may not agree with the numbers ultimately, but my goal was always to, at the very least, have them say, all right, we understand how you got where you got. I don't agree with you, but you've explained yourselves well.
Having the analysts be accountable for explaining their decisions is really important and helps produce much better products throughout the process. Many people, if they know somebody else is going to be reviewing their work, they naturally might push something forward that isn't maybe fully considered because of time constraints or whatever. There's lots of good reasons for why somebody might do that. But if you have a culture of accountability at that level, and then people are going to be able to produce much better work, which then gets reviewed and reviewed and reviewed, and each time improved. But that analyst accountability starts with a much stronger product if you have that as a culture in your organization.
That's really well said. I mean, that culture of accountability, I think, is really key.
Let's talk more about accountability. I mean, Karl, you mentioned risk mitigation. Teri, you talked about the story behind the numbers and explaining the work. Karl, you didn't flinch, and it didn't seem jarring when you mentioned that we have over $1 trillion net interest expense. Have we become just too desensitized to that? Is it the federal budget is so large in scope, that's to be expected? Let's put the story to the numbers here. Let's talk about risk. Let's talk about accountability. Why is that acceptable, or why are we not seeing that with the level of seriousness that it seems to suggest?
That's a great question. I think it's really difficult for everyone to understand these numbers. And maybe it's in part because everything is a really big number now. In the president's 2027 budget request, we're asking for $1.5 trillion for defense, for example, $500 billion more than
like a 40% increase.
So I think the numbers are really big. So this is actually a really interesting issue, and I've thought about this, and I've asked other people this question. How do you actually communicate the urgency of this issue in a way that can be effective? Because right now, Congress isn't dealing with this issue. And Congress deals with issues that are in their face, on their plate, that need to be dealt with. And right now, it's not seen that way, even though for a very long time, if not decades, professionals have been warning that this is a real issue that needs to be addressed. And we've tried to address it in different ways over time, unsuccessfully for the most part. But how do you express to the public the urgency of the situation in a way that drives change, right? Policy gets enacted when there's like a moment in time that is behind an issue that will create change. And what is that moment for the federal debt?
Yeah. And Teri, what do you think? I mean, we have lots of evidence that some of the largest costs to the federal budget are incredibly important issues like healthcare or national security, but they are also very big costs. So how would you go about trying to help decision makers make the right decisions on how to manage those costs for the long term?
And I think that's the key, is the long term. Congress tends to think in pretty short 2-year increments, and that long-term viewpoint is not always as in the forefront as I think it should be. And Congress, and I think a lot of people, respond to crises, to something that all of a sudden comes up and it's a crisis and we need to deal with it. And I think GAO and CBO and think tanks have been saying for a long time, there's a crisis coming, but that crisis doesn't feel imminent to the Congress. And if it doesn't feel imminent to them, then the incentive to deal with it now is not as strong as some of the short-term things they're trying to accomplish. So that's the problem, is how do you get a crisis-driven, short-term perspective organization to step back and look at the long term and come up with solutions that may hurt in the short run, but will help in the long run. And I don't know that anybody has figured out how to thread that needle.
I want to end with some optimism. You're both now in positions to shape the next generation. Karl, in the classroom, Teri, through your legacy and your networks. What's the one thing you wish young people entering public service today truly understood about budgeting and the impact it'll have on their work, but also the impact that it's going to have on society more broadly in the future.
I think most students don't understand the role of money and finance and budget in public service, and how important it is to understand those concepts. For example, in my very first class, I talk about the movie The Matrix, which you might remember as the Matrix being a software construct that humans live within. And Neo, the main character, at some point is able to realize that he's living in this software construct. And then once he gets to that point, he can see the code running through everything around him. And once he can see the code, he can then manipulate his environment to his advantage. And so I compare that sort of scene to understanding and getting the realization that the budget is everything in the delivery of public service and public services. And once you can understand the budget and how it works, it really empowers you to be able to create change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really that connection between budgets are an expression of policies and values. And I think that's really important. My first job out of graduate school was at the Urban Institute. I spent a couple of years there working on different public finance issues. And when I got the job at CBO, one of my colleagues there kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, now you're going to become a green eye shade." That idea being, "Oh, well, that's boring. You're going to go just crunch numbers." But what I found, and what I hope young analysts in public service realize, is just how important those numbers are. And as I indicated a little earlier, they tell a story, and they are an expression of the government and the people's values. And that's important. So to the extent that as a budget analyst, you are helping to articulate that, make those clear, whether you're on the advocacy end or the analytic end, that's an important part of governing. And it is really important part of governing. I hope people would have as much passion for it as certainly I have had over the years, which surprised me. I mean, if anyone had told me in graduate school I was going to be a budget analyst, I probably would have laughed at them, but turned out to be incredibly interesting and rewarding.
Budget and policy share a unique relationship. It's more than just crunching numbers, and it's something that we all need to be talking about and taking more seriously. This has been an interesting and informative conversation that shows why federal spending and smart budgeting matters for the future. Thank you, Teri and Karl, for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.